no worries.
Because I'm retired.
His is no worries because I'm the mother of the family.
Okay.
Mine's entitled Worries a Lot.
Worries a lot.
Yeah, those are two
I
names.
wonder what mine would be. Talks about. Where's my stool?
Mr. Wright.
Now, I don't know.
Somewhere. Rachel's.
Say just a seat for you. Okay.
Wait, is my cup in here? Oh, I can't find my Mr. Right cup. I don't know where it is. I'm really confused. I leave it like in different places because I always have it with me. So I stole the church's cup.
You need to go find your stool now.
Talk about being comfy, huh? Yeah. I can lay back.
Or this way.
That's what I was going to do. That's why I'm moving you. I can't wait more here.
I thought
Is this good?
I said, here, now I know I am.
I can't see it. No. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
You left. Okay, go.
Oh, she already back from work? Oh, my gosh.
So we have graduated. Well, today we will have graduated through the first section of Genesis. So this is going to be our graduation certificate to take home. And I'm debating if there is a video that corresponds to this
We've
chart.
seen it.
Have you seen it? Okay.
Awesome.
It's good.
It was in like the first week. And so I'm debating if we'll watch the first part today. It's 7 minutes and I don't want to hold you captive for 7 minutes to a video.
But I recommend the video. It's really good.
It is. It's awesome. And so I printed out these big charts. And I love these. This is from the Bible Project. It was one of the sources I'd recommended that first week. They do a good job at like telling the whole story of the Bible. And they'll connect the themes together through it. And so in the video that this is, it's like these are 2 pages of a book. And there's like a binder in between. And so we have finished that first page. And then next week we're going to move on to the second page. So that will be your graduation certificate that we'll all get.
Oh, great.
Can you play Pomp and Circumstance for us?
Is that a song? I don't know. Is that?
That's what they play when you graduate. That's always the song.
Oh, okay. All right. Pompous Circumstance?
Pomp and Circumstance by Edgar. You know.
I didn't know that was what it was called.
Yeah.
That cartoon covers how many chapters? Albert?
This covers all of Genesis, but the video, it's in 2 parts. The first video is 1 through 11.
You can go back and watch the other part.
Yeah, that
So,
was-
I do want to watch maybe the last 1 minute that covers our part and introduces us to the next part. But today, we're going to look at Genesis 10 through 11, which covers something we call the Table of Nations. Has anyone ever heard that term before? I'm going to use it a lot, and I'm referring to all of chapter 10. It's called the Table of Nations. And then chapter 11, which contains the Tower of Babel and also this another genealogy, because we didn't have enough genealogies in chapter 10. And this one is going to connect us to Abraham. I feel really weird without my stool. I feel like I need something to sit on. I don't know. So it got moved somewhere. I'll just leave it right here. Did anything stand out to you in chapters 10 and 11 that we looked at?
A lot of names.
A lot of names. Did anyone read it? I found myself having to skim it because I was like, I can't do this.
I read it.
What I noticed was that Shem, I believe it was Shem, was 100 years old when he left the ark. And that kind of surprised me for a son to be 100 years old.
Yeah.
So Daddy was 600 at that time. So.
There's also Shem's ages don't add up when you add them at different points. It gets kind of funny. And whenever people try to make the timelines, Shem's age messes it up because there is a missing year from his timeline from the ark. It's like that year didn't exist. We may have mentioned that in here, but you just have to skip that year to make the timelines add up, which I think is actually kind of cool. Because if you look at it as a form of uncreation in the flood, it's like it doesn't exist in God's timeline or God's history.
The thing that I got out of the Table of Nations was they said, here's this son, here are all these people, and they formed this nation. And then here's this son, here are all the people there, and they went and traveled here, and now they're there. So they're kind of explaining who the different nations of Israel are, or around Israel are at the time.
Yeah.
And how they got there.
And we're going to cover this, but there is nothing else like this around here. So a lot of the things we've looked at, it's very similar to another story. There is nothing else like this that gives an accounting for the whole world It's really unique and it's really strange. I'm gonna crack my window a little more because it feels warm. Well, these are all radiators and they just stay hot, so it's still letting off heat. Did anything else stand out to anyone?
Well, we finally got to Abraham.
Oh, we're finally getting there. Yeah. Well, Abram.
Yeah.
Not quite Abraham yet, so we're almost there.
Well, the Tower of Babel,
What stands out to you with it?
it was not a dedication to God.
Mm-hmm.
It was the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And so God cleanses the earth with a flood, and then man does not stay cleansed at all.
Yeah.
Wait to sin again.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I really, when I was getting ready for this, I went and rewatched this video. It's something I missed when we talked about Noah. And so it's like after the flood, it's like the fall happens all over again. And it starts that scene right after the flood where Noah's naked. So he was naked and ashamed. Just like right after the fall, Adam is naked and ashamed. And Eve, yeah. Which I missed that, and that didn't connect in my brain. But we're seeing the fall happen all over again. And here, right here in this Tower of Babel, which is going to lead us to Abraham. Like, God is working to try and fix it, kind of what messed up, and people just aren't getting along. And so then the new plan, if you will, that's a bad way of putting it, but it's Abraham, is this new method of redemption for all of humanity, which is going to lead to Jesus, if you're a Christian. So, I wanted to remind us where we are and our generations. So we were in the generations of the sky and the land. We were in the generations of Adam. We went through Noah. And now, today, we're going to cover Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we're going to look at the generation of Shem, which is going to be that part at the end of chapter 10. So we're covering two different parts. The generations of Noah's sons and the generations of Shem, who is that son through which Israel comes and leads to Noah. Later, we're going to get to some other ones, and we're going to mention that as well. Oh, and as our timeline, so this is the timeline we looked at before, and if you remember, I had a missing picture. I went and found it. This was the picture I was looking for, and this kind of counts up a little bit better. So if you count up, so in BCE would be 4162, which is like year 1. And then right here is the flood, is in 2506 BCE. It's 1656 years after. And we can continue. So now we're going to end up at the birth of Abraham. But you'll notice that there's some special numbers between all these big stages. This was the picture I had, and there was a fuller picture, and I can't find it. I just had this little screenshot I grabbed of the full picture. But in our timeline, we are jumping through some big stages. And we have covered a lot of time, but the next, the rest of Genesis is going to be this period right here. And so we're going to slow down a lot as we kind of move through the book of Genesis. But let's look at an overview. So Genesis chapter 10 is something we call the Table of Nations. That's a phrase, I'm just going to use it a lot. I'm not really sure why we call it that. I'm not sure when it became popular, but that's just how I know chapter 10. And in Genesis 11, it contains the story of the Tower of Babel, and it sets us up for Abram and Abraham. And so as genealogies are important, this section has 2 genealogies. I omitted them from what we're going to read because I didn't want to just say all these names that none of us know how to say. When I was in this room on Tuesday mornings, there's a men's Bible study. And I guess we had finished Genesis a few years ago and we're moving to Exodus. And it was one of the first weeks I was in it. And Ed Lester just goes, the termites, the Jebusites, the Scaredites. He just started making up all these names. And whenever I read a genealogy, I just start hearing termites whenever I read it. We're not going to read through all of those, but we are going to comment on some of them. And what's really special about these 2 chapters is that they're going to explain. So if all of humanity came from Noah, then why are we so different? Well, this is kind of the answer to that. So it's going to explain why we have all these different languages, but it also connects all of humanity together almost as like a kindred brethren. Or we're all one people in a sense. And this kind of perspective is very unique and different. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we jump into chapter 10. But the last part is, if you remember the first week, we divided Genesis into two main sections, the primeval history and the ancestral history. In the Genesis project, they call that Genesis 1 through 11 is God and the world. And then the rest of Genesis is God and Abraham's family. If you don't like to use the word primeval and ancestral, you can think of it like that. This is kind of a history of all of the world, and we're going to finish that today. And then we're going to zoom in on Abraham's family as we kind of zoom in more and more and more. Oh, before we read it, does anyone have any comment that they just want to make? You just loved chapter 10.
Well, I got a question.
Yeah.
The timeline you showed was very helpful. And maybe you don't know the answer to this, the myth of Gilgamesh, does it have a similar timeline?
So not in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but the similar story from which it comes is called the Sumerian King List.
Yeah.
And it lays out tens of thousands of years of histories, starting from like an original kind of mythic king. And then they go on and on. So it's not in the epic, but it's from the same place. The timelines that it gives, I'm not quite sure how it starts, but humanity lives for these like god kings are thousands and thousands of years old.
There were no dates in Gilgamesh.
Yeah, it's from the same area. It's not part of the epic, but it's the mythology from which Gilgamesh comes. Hey, Gilgamesh is going to pop back up today. So he surprised me. This will be probably the last time we mention him. I'll be sad. So before, I wanted to just read some of it. I liked color coding it when we did that last week. I might do it sometimes. I think it depends on how much time I have to get our little lessons ready. But we can just read this. Maybe. No, I'm going to start reading it this time. Actually, I'll just read the first line. And this is the lineage of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. And this just summarizes the next section. The sons of Japheth, the sons of Ham, the sons of Shem. And then it picks up in verse 31.
These are the sons of Shem according to their clans and tongues, in their lands and their nations. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their lineage and their nations. And from these the nations branched out on the earth after the flood.
And all the earth was one language, one set of words. And it happened as they journeyed from the east that they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let us bake bricks and burn them hard." And the brick served them as stone, and the bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, that we may make us a name, lest we be scattered all over the earth." Take it down.
Okay. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the human creatures had built. And the Lord said, "As one people with one language for all, if this is what they have begun to do, nothing they plot will elude them. Come, let us go down and baffle their language there, so that they will not understand each other's language." And the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it is called Babel, for there the Lord made the language of all the earth Babel. And from there the Lord scattered them all over the earth. This is the lineage of Shem.
And this is the lineage of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran begot Lot. And Haran died in the lifetime of Terah, his father, in the land of his birth. Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took themselves wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Isaac. Not Isaac.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And Sarah.
And Sarah was barren, she had no child. And Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, the wife of his son, Abram, and he set out with them from Ur of the Chaldees toward the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran.
These are some weird names, aren't they? I'm so glad we didn't read genealogy. I forgot to change this slide. What stands out to you as we read through this? Is there anything that stuck out?
Yeah, God called the people when he came down to see what they were doing, called them creatures.
Called them
I
creatures.
thought that was not a compliment.
Let's see what it says in another translation.
Oh, it is Milcah. Milcah married,
Well, I'm not sure where that
her first cousin? How's that?
yeah.
You have to think that happened a lot, given how they populated the earth. They started off with such a small group.
This translation says mortals, so I guess it's the word for
Mine says people.
people. Yeah. Bill.
Well, I think it's just interesting to make a specific point to say Sarah was barren. Because that's going to come back, of course, later on. And it seems like Sarah ends up in Egypt as the sister. They lie to the Pharaoh that she's the sister instead of the wife.
Yeah.
And that comes back to kind of haunt them too.
Yeah. That story pops up more than once too. Actually, that's a good point. And I was going to wait till the end. If you remember that chart we looked at the beginning, where it had Babylon and Egypt and Israel's here in the middle. So most of our interactions in this first section have been with Babylon. As we move into this next section of Genesis, we're going to move and we're going to start interacting with Egypt and Canaan. And so all of these things we've talked about, Babylon, they're going to start to just kind of float away. And that just has to do with the history of Israel and who they interacted with at different points. Now we're even going to go to Egypt, or near Egypt at least, and start interacting with the kings there. So we're going to be on a very different scene.
I was doing some snooping. My wife, she looked at Wikipedia.
Okay.
And about the Tower of Babel. You want to tell them?
Are you stealing my Wikipedia story?
Go ahead.
I Googled it. I didn't just said it was
Is this
There's an origin myth and parable meant to explain why the world's people speak different languages. Which I think
and they use a fancy word that starts with an E.
Right. There was a building that was similar to that.
We have pictures of it.
Yeah.
They're gonna pop up. Yeah. I also have a quote from that Wikipedia article, because there is something that I always like to read through the Wikipedia article. As one of the last things I do, and about one of the last slides, I didn't have enough time to write it out, so I just pasted the quote. And I put in here, this is from Wikipedia, because I don't usually do that. But Wikipedia can teach you a lot. It taught me something new. The comparative stories I didn't know that until this week. So let's look at our kind of preview of chapter 10. So as we look at the meta-narrative, let's remember we're in this generations, at least when we're starting off, of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And one other thing to note is that this is a large chiastic structure. And if you remember a chiasm, it's that thing that's kind of like a pyramid. And it starts with Adam, with Noah in the middle. And if you remember, when we read through the flood narrative, the chiasm in the middle of that was God remembers Noah. But what's really cool is there's a chiastic structure from all of Genesis so far, and Noah is in the middle of it. And what it is kind of like is we saw creation, there was uncreation, through the flood was recreation, and now we're going to watch uncreation happen again. And then there's going to be recreation with Abraham as he kind of starts on this new journey that's going to take place. Oh yeah, creation, uncreation, and recreation. The other thing that's really cool is this is ending a kind of chiasm through the first section of Genesis. It's also starting another chiasm with the number 70. And at the very end of Genesis is the middle of that chiasm. And then it gets repeated again in the book of Exodus. So that goes like chiasm, this idea of repetitions, when you repeat things, they can span books sometimes. And the whole Bible itself is like a chiasm. And so pay attention when things pop up, because the next time it pops up, it might be referring back to that original time, which is kind of what we're getting here.
Well,
What is that word peril?
That should say parallel.
That's what I thought.
Exodus written by the same people that wrote Genesis? And if it wasn't, then how did they know that to do the first half
So
to make it a chiasm?
yeah, if I might pull this picture back up. It's from one of our earlier ones where the first 5 books, there's 4 layers that kind of make up each one. And so for those first 5 books, Genesis and Exodus, there's 2 main things that make it up. And those are compiled together by a final redactor or editor. So these lines in here that are in bold on our paper are that editor. So they're the ones adding in the macro structures. So this whole, like, these are the generations, like those 11 generations setting an outline, that's put in finally by the editor. And some of these other lines, like when it refers to in 70 or numbers like that.
Yeah, or this guy died. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And even in this, there is different language between these are the sons of and he begat, which are evidence of those two original sources. So those things, a lot of times with the macro structures, the editor is kind of putting those together.
Okay.
At the very end.
Okay. The final edit.
Which is why it's not a mistake that the Genesis we have is put together. It was put together on purpose in this order. And that's a way of storytelling. Oh yeah, and this right here. So this that we're reading, so the different colors, it's a mix of priestly and non-priestly. And just because I knew someone would ask, we know that what they call different people in the Table of Nations, sometimes they're referring to a people group that's like from the early Bronze Age, and other times they're referring to a people group from the Iron Age. And it would almost be like today if I wrote a book, the history of Tennessee, Texas, and the Aztecs. One of those may sound off. The Aztecs don't really belong in that order. It would make more sense if I wrote like the history of the Cherokee and the Aztecs. And so you get weird like place numbers that are thousands of years off as a people group. And there's also references in that Table of Nations, that part we didn't read, to land masses or land markers that no longer exist. Because before you have roads, you would say like, well, walk by that big tower over there. And you might call that tower, the land around it, you would refer to that tower. And that tower doesn't exist. And in other parts, it might be referenced when it did exist. And there's also just different words that are used in parts of this genealogy. Sometimes they say sons of, sometimes they say begat, and they're different words in Hebrew. There's other things that we go, oh, this was written in 3 different stages for what we're reading today. Okay, that's our nerdy out. We're going to be done with the nerding out. I'm going to look in some of the details. So I put this on the back. And this is, I have 3 different pictures, and I could get none of them to not be blurry. And so I'm sorry that this is blurry, but this is the least blurry version I could get. And this shows around kind of where all these people groups are. And you might be interested to know is that these are all real people groups that we didn't actually say their names. And sometimes they might refer to a more general region of people that would take up lots of different people groups or tribes. And sometimes they're calling like what is really one tribe, they're describing the different clans. And usually it's more detailed the closer it is to Israel and who kind of interacted around Israel. And as you spread out, the the titles for people get a little bit more vague. So for instance, like around Israel, there's mentions to just different tribal regions around them. But as it spreads out in that table of nations, it might refer to a whole large people group.
Help me out. So what of these three descendants settled in Israel?
Shem.
Shem.
Which is where we get like the word
Okay.
S-E-M, like Semitic, comes from Shem, Semitic.
Okay.
Semitic peoples.
Okay. Thank you.
Also, I don't make note of this, but this is just kind of a fun thing. In this genealogy, there's a reference which is earlier, and it calls the people of Hebrews are descendants of Eber, which is then where the word Hebrew comes from. And so he's one of the, Eber is the original kind of patriarch of the Hebrews, but then later it's Abraham. And that comes from our different sources that are laid on top of each other. They had different origin stories of who was their main patriarch that kind of made them up. And in this genealogy, you get this mention of Eber, and he not really that significant. He's mentioned a few other times in scriptures. But there's fun genealogies. And what's really unique about this is no other nation has something like this. And it tells us something really powerful, that all people belong to God in a way. In a sense, we're all one humanity. Whereas a lot of other texts, when they'll write their kind of origin stories, they write about themselves as the people of God. They're the ones in who God has favor, and everyone else they can trample and conquer because they're beneath them. This is very different than that. So it's really unique from like a literary point of view. I tried to get,
Where they do end up killing and conquering each other.
Yeah, well, and we're going to make a comment on that in just a second. So I had this other chart. I couldn't get these to be not blurry, but this lays out a little easier. I think in the email, I might just link to these pictures because I couldn't download them and have them not be blurry. And then here's another chart. The only thing that I'll really note is Japheth is all of the friends of Israel, is anyone that's like a friend of Israel. Shem is anyone who's closely related to Israel. And Ham is anyone Israel hates, and it's the people that they conquer and enslave. And so there is also a little bit of kind of racism that pops up in here. So there is a little bit of that. But this is, Ham's sons are all the bad people, and they're the ones Israel conquers. Shem is anyone who's kind of closely related to Israel. Japheth is all the friends and everyone else. It's always fun to have that. And so what's so special about this table of nations? One thing, like we always said, it's really unique. No other culture has, like around the ancient Near East, they don't have this kind of table of nations that sounds like it's putting people on equal footing or of all being related. There's this significance to the number 70. So as we're starting to kind of interact a little bit more with Canaan, I'll just tell you a brief little thing about the main Canaan pantheon god is called El, and El has a wife named Ishtar, and they have 70 kind of deities underneath them, and those deities rule over different people groups, and they're almost like an angel or like a minor god that's over each people group. And so this number of 70 is very important in Canaan, which is when this is written, when Israel's in Canaan. And it has like all the people are kind of set in a boundary by the gods. So every people group belongs where they are, and each of them has their own little god. And it's also, the number 70 has other significance. At the very end of Genesis, Joseph goes with this family of 70. Not Joseph. Who's the family who goes to Egypt?
Moses.
Joseph.
No, it's is it not Jacob? Israel. Yeah, Jacob. I'm getting my name's confused. Well, Joseph is in Israel, but the original sons of Abraham that moved to Israel in the first place is Jacob, right? Yes, yeah, Jacob. And he has 70. There's a clan of 70 with him. And then also the elders that meet Moses up at Sinai is 70. There's 70 elders that rule over Israel. And then the Sanhedrin that rules over Israel later, it's 70. And that number 70, it represents in wholeness. It means everyone's accounted for. Just like that Canaanite idea, there's 70 nations. Each one has their own representative in God's council. There's the 70 represents wholeness, completeness. Everyone's represented. It's well ordered, that kind of thing. If you're curious, the Table of Nations pops up again in the Bible, although it's redone. So some of the people groups, their names are changed. Chronicles was written later, so it's an updated version. And sometimes the tribes end up in a different genealogy. They get mixed or thrown to another son. But it pops back up in Chronicles. It's in the book of Jubilees, which is that lesser Genesis we talked about a few weeks ago. And it's in the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Bible, it gets changed again. So there's lots of different versions of the Table of Nations. Oh, and it's mentioned in the New Testament in 1 Peter's. There's like a throwaway line that is a reference to this chapter. Also, there's a lot of special numbers, and we're not going to talk about those, but I think, Marilyn, did you mention about the 100 with Shem? Oh, was that you? Okay, yeah. So there's special numbers like that pop up. We're not going to talk about it, but just know that this is a poetic chapter, and it means things, and it's cool. But we're going to be done with the Table of Nations if y'all are okay to move on. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about Babel. That was out of order. Oh, no. We had one more part in chapter 10. Who is Nimrod? We don't know who he is. Do y'all want to learn about Nimrod?
Sure.
Okay, let me see what the time is. Did you shake your head no?
No, I didn't say that.
I'm not going to read all of this, but there's this line about Nimrod. So it says, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And then it names all these cities that he, as a king, he goes and founds all these cities. And there is apparently lots of speculation about Nimrod, and people care a lot about it. And we don't know who Nimrod is. If you remember, I told you one of my favorite stories in the Bible is when Israel wrestles with God. And there's this idea of struggling or wrestling with Scripture that kind of make up Israel's way of understanding Scripture. And it's almost like a series of circles. And so you start with the Torah, or the law, the instruction. And then you kind of expand, and it's the prophets, and they're writing about the Torah. And then there's the writings, and they're writing about the prophets that are writing about the Torah. And then there's the rabbis that comment on the writings, on the prophets, on the Torah. And it keeps expanding out, and they have this commentary called the Midrash. And everyone's arguing with each other, and they'll tell parables and stories based on Bible stories. And then each synagogue kind of wrestles with that Midrash. And then each individual wrestles with the way that their synagogue wrestles with that Midrash, that wrestles with the writings, that wrestles with the prophets, that wrestles with the Torah. And it's a really helpful way of looking at Scripture like this, because we usually can get the main idea of a story or of a point, because they all have like a similar idea of how they understand like a passage in Scripture. They might differ on it a little bit, but generally the main idea is the same. Nobody knows who Nimrod is, and we don't even know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. It's really weird. So his name, we think it may mean rebel. We know that he was some type of hunter warrior, and he was a king, and he founded these great kingdoms. I'm going to skip this commentary from reading it, but he seems to be like an archetype of warring civilizations. He also might be the archetype of perverted religion, or he could be the good guy. And there's hundreds of other stories about Nimrod, both in Jewish commentaries and that float around throughout all the ancient Near East. And sometimes he's good. Even there's a lot of Islamic stories about him. Sometimes he's bad. And the phrase that's used, he was before the face of God, it could mean that he was against God's face or that he was submissive to God's face. And we don't know if he's good or bad. Sometimes he is somehow popping up around Abraham and helps Abraham. Other times he's trying to kill Abraham. He's a really confusing character. And yeah, there's hundreds of stories. Most of them, though, he's a villain. And we'll just really quickly say where he kind of came from. He could be Gilgamesh himself, as Gilgamesh was this great king of Babylon. And so a lot of people look at him and go, this is probably referring to Gilgamesh. There's another king called Sargon the Great. which we won't mention, or he could be this god Nintura, who was a Sumerian god that was kind of a warrior god. But most likely, this passage about Nimrod, I think what it probably is, it's a compilation of different Babylonian kings. And he's an archetype of what it means to be a warrior king, or a warrior civilization, if you will. And so Nimrod pops up in Genesis 10 as saying, this is not the kind of people that you want to be. You do not want to be the people that go and conquer others. Or he could be a good guy. And there's some other stories like that. But I just want to make a note about that, about Nimrod. Also, people use this today to mean idiot. Like, don't be such a Nimrod. And in our etymology, we don't know why that popped up in English. And so Nimrod's just this really vague character. He's a lot of fun. If you're bored this week, you should look up who is Nimrod. Yeah, no, really. Like, if you can't fall asleep at night.
Verse 9, it almost exactly repeats itself. Is that because there were different authors and they just put them together, or did they do it because they wanted to emphasize this so that because this was all verbal at the time, want people to remember it?
This passage that's about Nimrod, we think that this came from the earliest version of the Table of Nations, so from the Yahweh source. And so this line is probably some type of poetic mechanism as drawing attention to that he is a great warrior and king. Almost like because it's repeating it, it's like drawing attention to it. But that repetition could be also, a lot of times those might mean a different author, but maybe not in this instance. All right, let's talk about Babel. John, you had some things to say about Babel.
Take the sun.
Did you already say them?
Yeah, there was a
Origin myth.
There was an origin myth, and that somewhere they built a tower. I have to look it up. Starts with an E, and I think it was that predated that, but that's where the myth came from.
Yeah.
They knew that there was this big tower that someone built and all that, and they said, fine. And somewhere, they're trying to figure out, well, why aren't we all talking the same and looking the same? It's like, how did humanity get here? They're trying to explain that.
It's the origin stories of how people are all together and yet still speak different languages.
Yeah, and they don't, and it's their view of it way back when. They're trying to make sense of it.
Susan, were you?
Well, I'm thinking in the New Testament, does it refer to Babel? Or when Jesus scatters the people and the languages?
So it isn't. In Pentecost is an undoing of Babel. And we're going to mention that at the end. But so this story is a significant story to explain why people speak different languages, yet are still all related somehow. So how does that work? It's significant in that it's the book of Acts, and the church starts by undoing what happens at Babel. And so it holds a lot of significance for Christian writers. And it's also a special story. It really just makes fun of the Babylonians. And so we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. So this story, it mainly comes from the Yahwist, or the non-priestly source, which is that earlier source, when Israel would have more influence with Babylon. And I've always thought about Babylon, the Tower of Babel, as being about people trying to get to God. Like they're building a tower so they can crawl into heaven itself. But it's actually the opposite. Oh, have you
I
known?
always thought that too, that they were trying to climb to get to God.
That's what I thought since I was a kid. But it's actually, the tower was for God to come down. And they're using the divine for their own purposes. The next slide is going to talk about this. And the line that it uses here is that humanity wants to make a name for themselves. And if you remember way back into the garden, kind of what started the fall, what started humanity or creation getting away from God's good order is people are trying to become like God. They're trying to take that image of God and use it for themselves, to glorify themselves. We're kind of seeing that come to fruition here. Or this is kind of like a new fall that happens in Genesis 3. So there is this thing called a ziggurat, which is this, if you read through the Old Testament and you hear it talk about high places a lot, that's kind of the same idea of a ziggurat. There were these towers, these temples that were built. And here's a picture of what one might have looked like. And Donna, by the way, these pop up in South America all over the place. I looked this up for you. So this is not unique to... and there's even similar stories about people building towers and languages getting confused in South America and in other places.
Well, in Mexico, they have the Incas.
Yeah, just like the Aztecs and the
You can
Incas.
still go and see them.
And so when you walked into Babylon, one of the first things you would see is this great ziggurat that would be up in the skies. Here's an artistic rendition of what that might have looked. Man, this is blurry too. I don't know what, all my pictures are blurry. Here's what it looked like. First thing I think when I look at that, wow, that's expensive. And remember we talked about civilization. As they got greater, you could have big building projects and they would enslave a lower class to kind of do that. That's what we're seeing here.
To me, it represents power.
Oh yeah. Look what we can build.
Don't mess with me. Look at this.
And we still do that. We build skyscrapers, and I like looking at big towers, like the tallest building, because we can do great things. Look, we can build this. This is what it looks like today. Not much is left.
Well, I'm amazed that there is something left.
ISIS, well, they came through, blew up parts of it. Oh, this is another ziggurat. By the time Israel was on the scene, that one in Babylon was gone, but there were different ziggurats all around. Actually, here's some popular ones. So the one in Babylon is called
That's what I was thinking.
Etaminaki, and it meant house of the foundations of heaven and earth. But there were other one. So the large ziggurat, which means the temple that links heaven and earth. You might see a theme kind of in the names. And there were the Zipar ziggurat, the stairway to pure heaven. But what's fun about the Tower of Babel, so the word Babylon is Babilu, means gateway of the gods. And again, it's not a gateway for us to get to the gods, it's a gateway for the gods to come down. And the word Babel, it's almost making fun of the word Babylon and the similarities, and it means to confuse, mix, to confound. And in the thing that we read, it kept using words like baffle and babble. It was trying to pick up on that mechanism in Hebrew, that these are similar words and they're mixing them around. In the ziggurat, like we said, it's what the gods would come up and down. And one thing to know about the way Mesopotamians and other ancient gods were understood, they weren't understood as these like kind of all-powerful gods like we think of God as being. They were understood of more like just upgraded humans. And they were anthropomorphized in heavy ways. And so you as the people would serve the god and fulfill the god's needs. And if you do that, God would serve you. He would bless you as a people. Usually you would conquer other nations and you would have more riches and more food and things like that. And throughout lots of different stories, things that the gods did a lot, they would need to fall asleep. If you remember when Elijah is kind of battling against Baal and he's like, maybe your God is sleeping. And he makes other euphemisms there, but the gods would need food. And not just divine food, people brought their gods food. That's why they would leave food at altars and things. The gods would want to have sex, and sometimes that's what people were used for. And they would have sex ceremonies at these big temples, and someone would be an embodiment of the god, maybe a priest or someone. They would become intoxicated, so they really liked to have their beer. And they were ignorant of what was going on outside of like what's just around them. So they're not omniscient, kind of in the way we think of God as knowing everything all at once. And so they would have to draw their attention, which is why you would then build a tower, because you want them to know about your city so that God would come and work in your city. And they had all these other needs. So this is the Mesopotamian way of thinking about God and the gods and the divine. And it's important to know this, because Genesis is this apologetic work arguing against these perspectives. And so when we come to the Tower of Babel, we're going to see something different. As an example, by the way, of what the gods would need. So that big ziggurat, in Babylon was for the god Anu or Marduk or Enlil, depending on what time phrase, or Zeus, if you even want to think he's kind of the same character. So every single day they would have to bring 6 vessels of barley beer, 5 vessels of Lapku beer, don't know what that is, but it sounds interesting, 1 vessel of Nasu beer, 1 vessel of beer from a jug, he really likes his beer, 1 alabaster vase of milk, 4 vessels of pressed wine. They would have to do a sacrifice every single meal. That would be 21 sheep that were the best of all the sheep. I mean, he's at high needs. And then 25 that are lesser quality ones, but not grain-fed. They had to be grass-fed. 2 fat-tailed oxen, and the list just goes on. Every day they would sacrifice these and just give these things to the god. He was needy, right? Oh my word!
I would say that they had really drunk priests.
Oh,
they had to get rid of that beer somehow. Help them out.
That's a lot of sheep.
And so that's a lot of sheep and a lot of beer. It's just what I'm thinking, and wine and other things. So this is the perspective how people think about their gods. You build these towers and you serve that god, and then that god will serve you. And you could almost capture a god to do your work and your will. The Tower of Babel flips the story backwards. And so humanity, they're building this ziggurat so that they can capture this god and make a name for themselves. And really this story, it's kind of making fun of Babylon, because Babylon was the one with the ziggurat that went up to the heavens that they would serve the gods. And it's also making fun of other Meso-Sumerian cultures that did the exact same thing. So it's not just about Babylon. I copied this from Wikipedia because in our trying to do comparative myth things, there's a similar Babylonian story to the Tower of Babel, and it's called Imnakar and the Lord of Arada, which is a city that was this female goddess. But it's a Sumerian myth that is essentially the same as the Tower of Babel, and the languages get confused and all these things. As always, there's differences to it, and there's differences to ours. And one of the main differences is that in the Genesis story, humanity is scattered around the world as a fulfillment of God's plan and as a perversion, or not to preserve what it means to be human and what it means to live in God's good world. It's not as much as just like a punishment, like people are like roaches and you're squishing them. It's to preserve the good world. And so just some funny parts about this. When you read about this in Genesis 11, so they've built this great tower because they have this new technology, the brick. And they build this giant thing, and God can't even see the tower. So God has to kind of come down from heaven and be like, oh, is there a tower down there? And it's comical when you read this. And the other part is, that Mesopotamian way of understanding God is they have to have this tower. God just like steps aside and doesn't even use the tower to come down. And so again, it's kind of making fun of people. And people here in this story, so they're dispersed. So their languages are confused. They don't all speak one language. And it's in a way to protect religion and culture. So on the one hand, in the Tower of Babel, we learned something about religion. You can't use God. God is God and we are people. And it's not about us making a name for ourselves. It's about protecting the name, the glory of God. And so on the one hand, this is about humanity not trying to cage God in and misuse God for their own purposes. God's not the genie in a bottle that you can get what you wish from. But it's also about protecting culture. So again, we see this theme in Genesis that big civilization, big cities, they kind of are bad. They're evil because they take advantage of other people. And humanity was not made to be great and powerful and enslave others. We were meant to live a more kind of peaceful, calm existence, kind of in peace with one another, not great warring societies. But there's also really big moral and Christological meanings, and namely, like Susan mentioned about Pentecost. So if you remember in Acts chapter 2, all of the disciples are together, they're in a room, and suddenly there's this just rush from heaven, and their faces catch on fire, and then they go out, and they all start speaking all these different languages. They're preaching, but everyone understands it in their own language. And what happens after that is that all these people that travel to Jerusalem, that were doing this Jewish festival, they all stay. And so it's an opposite of what happens at Babylon. When people gather to make a name for themselves, the result is that we separate. When you gather in the name of God, we're brought together. And so there's just really powerful ways that this Tower of Babel gets used throughout Scripture, and how you serve God. But there's other meanings too about not taking advantage of others. Don't use technology to abuse other people. So we have more technology than bricks now, but it's still about how we use the resources that we have. Any other comments on Babel? Do you like the Tower of Babel, this story? Is this a new way of looking at it with the ziggurats and things? I think it's fun. Okay, this is kind of finishing up our slides. So we're finishing that primeval history, and we're moving to ancestral history. So what we've looked at thus far in Genesis has had a very different tone than we're going to go moving forward. So if you're not the biggest fan of doing the comparative myth and looking at Sumerian things, you're in luck, because we're moving away from Babylon, and we're not really going to hang out there much more. However, with that said, we are going to start interacting with Canaan and Egypt. And for me, I find it just vastly powerful to know the context of what we're reading so that the meaning stands out. And so coming on the scene as we come to Abraham, he's going to go to Egypt, and it's going to interact a lot with Canaanite understandings. We're still going to flesh out the context of those, but not in the same detail that we've done this first section of Genesis. We're about to pop up onto Abram or Abraham. And my question is, because I mentioned it in the first week or the second week, does anyone know what Abram means? Or Abraham?
I read it and I had forgotten. One of them means God of this nation, and Abraham means God of all nations, or something like that.
Father. So Father Abraham.
Yeah, not God.
Many sons. Many sons. Yeah. So Abram means father of a nation, and Abraham is father of many nations. Yeah, there you get the gold star. And so Abraham becomes really important, and even that name, the father of many nations, and in a sense, Abraham becomes the father of the whole world. And the way that as Christians we would read Scripture is through Abraham salvation comes to all. And God is the Father of all through Jesus. And this is a zooming in what God is doing. So we just covered like thousands of years of history in 11 chapters. Most of the rest of Genesis is just going to hang out with Abraham and his grandsons. Okay. I have a video that I might want to show. But before we get there, and I ask you that, as we've kind of finished this first 11 chapters of Genesis, what has been your like, wow, that's cool, or I don't really like thinking about it in that way? I'm interested in what you've thought so far as we've journeyed through Genesis.
I've never thought about it that deeply before. I just read it and go, oh, that's nice.
All the comparative myths were interesting, really fascinating. Because I sure didn't get that in my little
a lot of these are still newer to me, too.
Christian college I went to.
No, I always thought it was boring. I had a hard time paying attention to it, and you've made it very interesting.
Yeah, usually when you go in more detail things, you find a lot more that's there. Is there any specific things that have kind of storied out as we've gone from Adam to Cain and Abel and Seth and Lamech and Noah and all the others?
Well, I think it's very interesting that God created man and then he annihilated man. Because man turned out to be misbehaving. So it was kind of in a sense, a punishment, but it was a cleansing too.
Yeah.
And now, instead of being descended from Adam and Eve, we're really descended from Noah and all his progeny. And I suppose some mathematician has sat down and see if that's possible. Exponentiation generations. And it probably is if you put Noah back far enough that the descendants could populate the world today. I don't know.
If you're interested in that sort of thing, there are whole books that will,
I imagine there are,
will lay the sons of Noah over different haplochromosomal groups.
I like your
maybe
idea,
not the most credible,
or your attitude, I guess. One of your favorite adjectives is strange. This is a strange story. And really, I guess another word for that would be skeptical. And I think so many of us, going way back, we were taught from this age, we'll read the story of Genesis. We'll read about the creation. We'll read about the fall of man because they disobeyed God. And so they were punished. And finally the whole world was flooded. And that's how we all grew up. But you've liberalized my thinking.
Oh no.
So for that, I'm very thankful.
One thing I forgot to mention actually is part of as we move from primeval to ancestral, what we've been looking at is just mythic characters, so they all represent something. So everyone's name has had a vast meaning, and they're playing the place in an important story. So Adam, who means human, or Eve, who is life giver, or Cain, who is means empty, or Abel, who means not farmer, shepherd. All these names have had these different mythic meanings of covering great stories, and they're all kind of apologetically playing off of these Babylonian stories. We're about to switch off the mythic label, and we're going to switch into what we're going to call legendary figures. And so when we come to Abraham, we're going to hear about stories of possibly a real person, but who is like Abraham is a title, not a name. And so we're switching to legendary. And so it's going to change the context of what we're reading, because we're going to hear about now real places and things like that. And so it's going to be a tonal shift as we move, which is going to be fun. What has been your favorite story so far from Genesis 1 through 11?
I like Noah getting drunk.
Noah getting drunk.
It's just the Bible's supposed to be this reverend thing, and Noah gets drunk.
Yeah.
It's like, how did that get in there?
Just wait till he gets a lot of his daughters.
Yeah.
That's when it's going to get really weird.
Seems to be a theme.
Yes.
Getting drunk.
And
They probably they couldn't drink the water. They had to drink alcohol. I don't know. I mean, you would have thought back then the water would have been pure.
No, the cow.
Oh yeah, that was the excuse at least.
it's going to show the warts and all. Is there a story that particularly you found captivating or interesting?
Well, I agree with John. I mean, I've read Genesis and I don't remember that part.
We were never taught that in Sunday school class.
No, we were not.
Oh man. Yeah, that's one of those ones that's the benefit of a lectionary is you can skip over the uncomfortable ones that you can't mention in 10 minutes.
Well, I like the fact that you explained the meaning of Noah's son looking on him and it being such a horrible thing. Because I mean, I just took it literally. Really looked at him. Why is that horrible?
Yeah.
So I appreciate you explaining that.
Humanity is still messed up. Well, I want to show you your graduation certificate. So here's your graduation chart. Do you want?
All this learning happening.
Do you want a graduation certificate? We finished primeval history.
Oh, exciting. Good to see you.
Thank
Good to see you.
Billy, you should take lessons from
Oh, gosh.
Alexander. I have never seen anything so excited about the horrible things happening in the Bible.
Some things excite one soul.
If y'all would entertain me, I would love to show you the last 3 minutes of this video.
Sure.
That's good.
Oh, the 1 through
You
11.
can watch all 7 if you wanted to show it.
Well, I don't want to capture you for that long.
Is this covering what chapters, Alexander?
So this chart covers chapters 1 through 11 here.
What are you going to show?
This is chapters 1 through 11. So I will look at the last. Let me.
This is a Bible project, right? Did you say?
Correct. Yeah.
This is right here. We'll watch it again.
Did you watch this one?
Mhm.
Here, watch it all?
Here we go. So
No, we just watched the first part.
I'll just catch you up on what it mentions. This video, it goes through creation and it's an animated version of this chart. And what it is telling you in the part we didn't listen to is essentially we saw the world created and then it was uncreated through Adam and Eve in the fall. And so God recreates it with the flood, and then again it gets uncreated right after the flood in that story about Noah, which is right where we're going to pick up on. And that's essentially what it is so far. And so it's piecing together God created a good world and we're trying to continue the good world. And God keeps giving humanity a chance, and that then leads to Abraham as the final kind of goal for redeeming the world.
Noah and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first. And the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. And these stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
That's just a preview. I'll send the link to this full video, and I highly, highly, highly recommend the Bible Project as a source. They have a podcast as well that gets very long and in depth, and if you want to nerd out even more, more than we do in this class, their podcast would be great. That's Genesis 1 through 11. Thank you guys for staying with it so far. I know it's been a weird journey. We've looked at strange stories. I didn't realize that. Do I use that word a lot?
What?
Strange? I didn't realize that I did, so that's funny. Okay, all right. We're going to look at some more strange stories coming up. But it'll be a different tone as we look at Abraham. So I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm not sure how far we'll get next week.
What should we read?
So I'll send it. Read Genesis 12
That's all?
I'm not sure how far we're gonna get. I will send it in the email, so look out for it. I usually know more in advance where we're going. I have no idea where we're going yet. So, I think we might. I don't know. I'll try to make my nose go farther through 12, but I'll send it in an email.
Well, I have loved it, Alexander, so thank you.
And you're a gifted teacher, you really are.
Oh,
Very
thank you.
excellent.
I find that to be encouraging. I find it to be very encouraging. Thanks, John. I'm gonna hold on to that.
Yeah, you are.
John, we talk about that every week, Alexander.
Yeah, wait.
Oh, we should probably turn the camera.
Is
I
it your
have-
goal to be a teacher? Is that what you want?
Say again.
Is that your goal?
No, I want to do church work because when you do teacher stuff, you can't. I want to be able to make the mention about the Christological and moral meanings.